Great, thank you, Rachel. And Jason, thanks for the content there. I think it was very helpful to kind of set the stage for the discussion that we were going to hopefully take over the next 50 minutes as we take an in-depth look at the implementation process for GASB 87. Specifically about myself, I'm with RGP. I'm a vice president in the advisory and project services focusing on finance transformation. My background, about 15 years in public accounting with another 15 years working in industry. I've been with RGP for some total of about 8 years. And most recently, over the last 5 years, I've been working extensively in the finance transformation, GASB 87 lease implementation space. As we kind of talk about the process of implementing GASB 87, I'd like to kind of break it down into a few main area topics, which is first, let's just have a good understanding of what that high level methodology is and what's involved in that. And then we'll break it down into the individual components of the implementation activities and the transformation, the data collection, and then ultimately the system implementation. And then finally, at the end, kind of rope in some project governance and why that's important in the process of implementing. So when we start with the implementation of the methodology itself, I mentioned that I'm with finance transformation, and I think that the important context with GASB 87 is to understand this is broader than just a standard, an accounting standard change. This is actually going to impact all components of your organization. And in such, with that finance transformation, we have to take a broad approach in making sure that A, we approach the adoption correctly, but B, more importantly, that the organization is set up to succeed into the future, so to sustain that compliance with the standard. And so our methodology encompasses the full breadth of that. In the upper left-hand corner, we talk about the assessment and policy. That's extremely important. I think Parker indicated that, the completeness of the population, understanding what you have, that is key in kind of driving the rest of the project or the adoption component of it. And so the assessment and policy is focused on just that and making sure that you've identified that complete population of leases for your organization. And more importantly, you can prove that to an external auditor. I think a lot of organizations feel fairly confident with their listing of leases, what they've identified as leases. But at the end of the day, if someone were to ask, can you prove that you have everything, that proof may be lacking. And so the assessment in and of itself is to build that argument, is to build that case, so that once you have completed the assessment, you can basically make the statement that you have a complete population moving into the next stages of the implementation methodology. The next stage is the process transformation, and this is where we take a moment to kind of detach from the adoption component of the project and think more about day 2 sustained compliance. And so we start to gather the various stakeholders within the organization to identify what is the existing process for the procurement of assets under lease, and then more importantly, how we address changes to that portfolio over time, such that finance is notified and brought into the contract at the stage where they need to, in order to identify whether it first is applicable for GASB 87, and secondarily, how to make sure that their systems are set up so that they track the journal entries accordingly. So that process transformation is beginning to look at that day 2 process and making sure that we have a full end-to-end process to manage our lease portfolio, as well as the internal controls. I think it's key to understand that we still have to maintain control over that completeness assertion, the accuracy assertion. Those are key with the adoption of the standard. And so we do recommend that during that process design of kind of the transformation phase there, that you do a control assessment and make sure that if you've introduced new processes to the end-to-end process or new activities, that those are appropriately controlled and that they are monitored to ensure compliance and with the standard, as well as just to maintain the overall completeness and accuracy assertion. The third component of the methodology is the data collection, and I will be honest with you, this is the most time-consuming and most critical component of the project. This is not only just gathering the contracts, this is also identifying the data elements that are going to be necessary for you to do the accounting in day 2 under the new GASB standard, and then to appropriately extract those data elements from all of those contracts. And then more importantly, to maintain that accuracy assertion, there needs to be a secondary validation of that data before you use that in any technology strategy. So the abstraction process or the data collection process can take a significant amount of time, and we'll talk about that when we get into that phase of the in-depth review here. But I will tell you that the challenge with this is that it's typically a lot of work that has to be done in a short period of time. In the overall window of an adoption process, you're looking 4 to 6 months of work to get that done. The data collection may have to get done within a 2 to 3 month window. When you see the number of hours that are allotted towards data collection, abstraction, and validation, you'll see why that is a significant challenge for a number of organizations. Lastly is the technology strategy. And as good as the solutions are that are out there today, and the way that they are rolled out to the organizations and the methodology that's used, I'm happy to say that this is the easiest part of this project. The way that the technology gets deployed, the way it's rolled in, the methodology that we use as a partner to assist in that has been done and done over and over again, and it's been tried and true. So I think when we talk about the big circle, and that I call the big circle activities everything but the technology strategy, all of the risk and all of the heavy lifting and the unknown is typically in those big circle activities. Once you get to the small circle or the technology strategy, you pretty much have ironed it out and identified all of your risk areas and addressed those accordingly, such that once the technology is in place, you're ready to roll for day 2. So now we'll take an in-depth review of what's involved in that assessment process. So as I mentioned, the GASB lease assessment component of the methodology is designed to ensure that you have a complete population and that it's been captured and that you have adequate documentation to support that by an external review of your auditors. And so, typically organizations have an existing listing of leases that they've been using to provide for disclosure in previously audited financial statements. The goal is to use some audit techniques to ensure that that listing is accurate and complete. And so, that would involve doing some audit sampling and testing for completenesses of the lease listing, doing some training internally to ensure that the organization is aware of what is an embedded lease and the challenges that are posed by these types of contracts, and then doing some formal review of some of those contracts to ensure that when they have been identified that they are appropriately included in the population. When we talk about these areas, as I mentioned, that the goal there at the right is just to obtain enough documentation to answer that question that the auditors are going to ask, is how do you know that you didn't miss anything? And so these activities have been designed to create that argument or the documentation to support that assertion to your auditor that you have a complete and accurate population. And we do that to, again, make sure that the identified leases are complete, and then more importantly, to identify areas within your organization where maybe you haven't identified leases, and using some techniques to systematically review that and come to a conclusion around the completeness. So when we're talking about the actual the identified lease validation, we typically do a couple types of audit sampling to ensure that you actually have an accurate population of leases. The first is to test those transactions that the organization has probably already identified, and that would be those transactions that are currently being coded to your rent and lease expense accounts. So taking a subsample, so taking a dump of, say, the last 6 months of data from those rent and lease expense accounts, using data analytics, you can look at the individual payments or the individual transactions and identify transactions that look like leases over a period of time, and that would be represented by the same vendor for the same amount over a number of months. And then you select a sample of about 30, 45 transactions, and you test whether or not those transactions that hit the rent and lease expense accounts, if they actually are leases. And that will involve pulling the contract typically and looking at it and determining whether or not those need to be included in your listing. And then if they needed to, were they accurately picked up by the organization? Again, hopefully this will not derive any exceptions. If you do identify exceptions where you maybe have found a transaction in the rent and lease account that was not being maintained on your lease listing, then as an organization, you need to determine, A, was it an isolated occurrence? And if it was an isolated occurrence, why is it an isolated occurrence? And B, if it wasn't isolated, do I have potentially some ineffective internal controls, or is the process broken in the way that I obtain that listing of leases? And that may require you to expand that sample size to where you become more comfortable that it was an isolated occurrence. You're not finding systematic issues with leases not being picked up for that lease listing through this analysis. So you take that, and that's basically step one of the audit sampling approach to the identified lease validation component. The second item would be to identify transactions that were miscoded. So these are rent and lease transactions that for some reason did not hit the rent and lease expense accounts on the P&L. And so in order to do this, we typically take an accounts payable dump or payment file for the last 6 months. And we try to look at the account distribution to make sure that the account distribution is not already included in the first population that we tested. And then we're going to do those same data analytics to determine whether or not we can identify payments that look like leases, that have characteristics of leases from month to month for particular vendors, and then select a sample of those. Once we select those samples, we typically involve reviewing the contract and determining whether or not it actually is a lease. Again, these were transactions that were not coded to the rent and lease account. So ideally, you would hopefully find not too many that were leases. And in that case, again, a positive outcome here would be to select a sample of 20 to 30 transactions and not find any transactions that actually represented leases that hadn't been captured by your organization prior. So those are for the two main components of the identified lease portfolio. Now the second part of that, I think my mouse, there it goes, is those unidentified leases, and that gets us into the sticky area of embedded leases. And so embedded leases, identifying embedded leases is, I will tell you, it's more of an art than a science. These are contracts that do not typically say lease or rental agreement anywhere on them, but they do involve the use of an asset that does fall under the definition of GASB 87. And so therefore, it does require us to use a little investigative techniques to identify and make sure that we've identified the significant contracts that potentially house embedded leases. This usually involves a multi-pronged approach. First, we try to sit down with procurement and give them a general basic training on what is an embedded lease. This is not meant to make them technical accountants. It's not meant to make them finance people. It's meant to make them aware of what is at a base level, what is an embedded lease. And the good example of the coffee machine in the break room is always good to have, where we're not paying for the coffee machine, we're paying for the coffee service every month. And so we get that asset for free. That's a good example of what an embedded lease is. And then we talk about other areas that are specific to their organization that they might have some. And I think those areas involve IT, warehousing, marketing, various other areas of the business where typically maybe procurement hasn't thought of that before. And you'll kind of use that as a good, I guess, brain jarring session where we'll get finance people to take the information that they've learned in that training and then go back to their desk and apply that to the contracts that they've seen come across their desk. And then begin to filter or to route identified contracts to finance for further analysis. So this is going to be, them going and identifying, potential contracts, saving them to a central repository, and then finance is going to come in and do a more formal review of it to determine whether or not they actually do have an embedded lease. And that is that third part, that embedded lease review that's typically done by finance. Now, the first thing that I would tell you is, before you review any of these for embedded leases, make sure that you apply the appropriate scoping and policy considerations, that being materiality and short term. If you've made the short term lease exception and you identify that these contracts are less than 12 months and have no extended option periods attached to them that go out beyond that, you can immediately discard those contracts for review, as well as those contracts that may be immaterial in scope. And so you only want to actually perform that detailed review for contracts that pass that initial scoping. And then you're going to go through the process of reviewing it. And this is a granular process of looking at whether or not the embedded assets in the contract actually meet the definition of a leased asset under GASB 87. And then if so, performing the applicable fair market value analysis and allocation of the contract amount between the service and the asset. Now, I will tell you that GASB 87 does require you to perform this. So it's not where you can make an election, as the non-governmental entities actually were given an election to not have to perform this if they wanted to. But governmental entities, if they can reasonably assert or estimate the value of the service and the asset components, they are required to actually allocate that as part of this embedded lease review. So the assessment activities are very, I guess, challenging to many organizations. I think the first part that we talked about around the audit sampling and the techniques there, I think those will ring true for many people, and they probably performed some component of that. But the embedded leases, and I've shown you here a sample slide that we use along with a few others to kind of, to train those procurement people, is where you typically find a little bit of more private investigator techniques, where you're actually trying to identify, contracts that are potentially leases that, they don't say lease or rent anywhere on them. And so it does become more of an art than it is a science. Now, at the end of the assessment phase, most organizations should have available, if you performed all of these activity, an executive summary. This is basically going to be a summary of all the activities that you did during the assessment phase to ensure that you came up with a complete lease population. And so you're going to summarize how you got your sample sizes, how you looked at various accounts, which accounts were reviewed, what contracts were reviewed. And you're going to have all of that documentation maintained to support that executive summary. So the summary is meant for the external auditors to provide them an overview. Then you have all of the backup documentation to support any of the testing that you did. Hopefully at this point, you will have contemplated the use of a project plan, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on in the slides. But the last point there is just documenting any key decisions that you've made around GASB 87. So that being, the short-term lease exception, as well as any materiality considerations that you've identified, and kind of getting those into an election memo that will simplify the review for your external auditors. At this point, this brings us to our first polling question, and there is no right or wrong answer to these. It's more a gauge just to get an understanding from your organization of where you think those challenges are going to actually take place. For the assessment activity, we look at a number of different areas. One could be locating the actual physical contracts. Some could be applying the actual standard and determining what are actual lease contracts. Some could be lack of resources. Some could have trouble finding contracts that may have embedded leases, and then some just haven't started. And again, there's no wrong answer here. We'll give you a few minutes to answer this, and then we'll come back with the results of the poll and kind of talk about that briefly. All right, I'm not sure if we have the results that we can pull up at this point. some of you may not have already answered yet, but I think for the guys of going forward, we should hopefully be able to look at those.
Hi, Tim. So right now we've got about 15% on the actual physical lease contracts, 22% for applying the new standard, 16% for lack of resources, 27 report for finding contracts, and 20% have not started. At this point, if I show the results, people will have to stop voting. So let me give it another minute
That's
or so before I close the poll.
I think that, as I mentioned, I think, the results are pretty indicative of the fact that, you can probably expect these challenges, all of these, to be in some form for your organization. Now, the whether or not it's the greatest challenge, that will be depending upon your organization. But I would just keep in mind that there is there's a lot more to the assessment than just kind of identifying my leases and pulling up the leases that I know about. As you can see, it's pretty much 20% across the board if you round up, and that would be pretty common to what we've seen. For those areas, finding contracts in the embedded lease space, I think that is, as I mentioned, it's more of an art form than a science. So it's a little bit more fuzzy, and it may be a little bit. I think the goal there, and I've had this conversation with external auditors before, but the goal there is to deploy a methodology that you can then turn around and say that you did not miss anything significant. I think the idea that your external auditor expect that you find every single embedded lease, I think that's probably unreasonable. But you can deploy a methodology that would ensure that you did not miss anything significant. And that's where I would hang my hat. So thanks for the time for sharing your responses there. So if we think about the next phase, that being process transformation, this is the area of the project that for me is where the value actually resides, because a lot of organizations, and we actually saw this on the counterpart in the public industry with the 842 adoption with the public entities, is that a lot of organizations did a really good job of getting ready for day one, but 6 months after the adoption, their entire database of leases had become stale. And that was mainly because they had lacked the vision to actually come up and ensure that their day two processes were clearly defined, roles and responsibilities were defined, and that everybody understood that in this new world post-adoption, that things were going to change. And when you think about the procurement of assets within your organization, it typically involves a lot of different components of your organization. It could be procurement, legal, IT, shared services. Many different parts of your organization can be impacted or play a part in the existing process for getting leases or getting assets under lease. So we tackle the process transformation by using a couple of different components, the main being a visioning workshop. And this is where it's more around process development, where we're taking all the active stakeholders within the organization and bringing them together so that we can enlist their help to be part of the future process. Again, that is just to build internal support for the changes and to make sure that everybody is aligned with what the requirements are and help in defining what the new responsibilities are. We always document that and socialize that so it becomes a significant component of change management. And then lastly is finalizing that policy around GASB 87. So the process and the policy become the governing process and governing document for your future state. And so that being the case, the sooner that you can get this in the hands of those that are going to be effective, and the more that you can communicate that ahead of the adoption, the more likely you will be to be successful 6 months, 9 months down the road. So as I mentioned, for me, this is where the value resides, making sure that the organization is in a position so that 6 months after the adoption, 2 years after the adoption, they're still capable of producing journal entries that are compliant with GASB 87. So let's start with the visioning workshop. And as I mentioned, this is a cross-functional collaborative workshop focused on getting leaders within the organization to provide input, guidance, and direction in that future state process. In those groups that are typically involved, finance, procurement, real estate and facilities, treasury, IT, shared services, many other groups that maybe I haven't listed here, that have a part in the organization's procurement of assets under lease or real estate leases. So this process involves kind of starting with their existing process, identifying where there needs to be changes going forward. So if we think about, embedded leases and the requirement going forward that we have to review these, then we're probably going to have to at least build in a touch point within our procurement process such that when certain criteria are met on a contract, that it gets forwarded to finance. So you can build out a process and build out a cheat sheet for procurement so that they can answer 2 or 3 questions about a contract. And if they do, they now have to route that contract forward to finance so they can determine whether or not it has an embedded lease. Other areas that may be impacted by this, and we actually encourage this, is using this as an opportunity to provide that greater governance and to improve the processes that are in place today under the guise of this GASB 87. So in this case, maybe in the past you haven't really done a lease versus buy analysis on whether or not you should lease or buy an asset. Well, since they're all on the balance sheet now, there really is no incentive to do a lease just to purely hide it on the income statement. So maybe I want to deploy that governance and put that in place so that now I'm making the right economic decisions when I'm procuring assets for my organization. So this is the perfect opportunity for us to begin to kind of weave those best practices into place, identify where those changes need to occur within the organization, and then to get that formalized into a documentation that outlines the process as well as the roles and responsibilities of those involved. Once that's done, you of course want to socialize that and kind of continue with the policy development. So once you've got the process kind of sketched out, you socialize it, ask for feedback, get internal buy-off on the future state, and then you go about finalizing the policy. And this policy is going to be the governing policy or the governing document over that process that you just created. And so the policies should outline, the purpose, scope, policy, roles, responsibilities, etc. These are an example table of contents that we've derived for assisting clients before. So again, this is specific to your organization, but we do encourage that you take the time to craft that policy or that governing policy for your new process, such that you can use these 2 components to be the kind of catalyst for change management. So when we think about process transformation, at the end of this, we should have at least a draft accounting policy that we're ready to circulate to the organization, as well as the process documentation that has been socialized and signed off by the key stakeholders within the various components of the organization that outline what's going to change once we do adopt GASB 87. And then taking that information, developing a management plan or a communication plan to the user base to ensure that they are aware of what's changing, what are the new rules and roles that are involved, and kind of what they can expect to do after they adopt the standard. So these are all key components of the process transformation. So this brings us to polling question number 2. Within your organization, how many functions are typically involved in procurement of assets under lease? And that could be either embedded or real estate or equipment. How cross-functional is your organization? And again, I think you'll see a wide variety of disparate answers here, but I think it does highlight the fact that there are a number of different people that are impacted by this. So we'll give everybody a minute to answer. And then when you're ready to provide the results, just let me know. All right, do we have any results to share at this point?
Yes, so far we have 10% of folks that have 10 to 11% for the 1, 45% for 2 to 3, 16% at 4, and 28% at
5+. Yeah, and I would expect, you know, especially in government organizations, are typically
the 5+.
Within those government organizations, there typically is a lot of cross-functional groups that are involved that have to be aligned as part of this process transformation. And so, again, getting all of those key stakeholders to the table on the front end will greatly improve their buy-in on the back end. I think if finance and accounting are to, were to develop the process and push it out without any involvement of those other organizations, there may be some pushback. So again, getting them to the table and helping them devise what that process is going to be will greatly improve your chance of embedding that that change within the organization. Great. Thanks for the information. So we'll move on to the next section, which is data collection. And as I mentioned, at least from our experience, data collection typically is the most cumbersome, time consuming, as well as important component of the adoption process. And I think one of the challenges that we see is, you know, we go through all this activity to identify the population of leases and in that first assessment phase. And then we embark on this journey of getting all the data and abstracting that into a central repository so that you can potentially use it for a technology strategy. And while you're doing all of that data abstraction, collection, and everything, the data is changing. And so it's kind of like trying to nail Jello a little bit. And so I think the important component here is to understand that, you know, there is two components to data collection. There's collecting the data on the leases that you've identified during the assessment. And then the second component is the incremental data change, which is going to be the data change or the data that has, or the new leases or changes on leases that have occurred since the date of your assessment to the date that you actually turn on your technology strategy. And so in data collection, there's a number of different activities involved, but at the end of the day, the most important part is to identify the data elements within each of the contracts that are going to be used by your technology strategy to provide you the accounting and the disclosure under GASB 87. Once you've identified those data elements, then you have to go through the process of getting them from its raw sense, whether it may be the actual physical contract, to its actual final resting place in an upload template. And the techniques that are deployed are, we use the terms of abstraction, extraction, and then we also have artificial intelligence that is available in this space to assist in the data collection activities. So we think about data abstraction. Data abstraction, you know, at its rawest sense is actually, you know, opening up the contract, the physical contract, and reading it and pulling out the data. You know, and when you've potentially identified the technology strategy, you're going to have a good idea of probably 90% of the data elements that are needed for that software, and therefore you could begin this process of abstracting the data from the contracts. You know, again, the challenge is here, you know, identifying where all those contracts are, getting them into a central repository. And it usually requires a team of abstractors in order to read that contract. And if you think on average, there's anywhere from 50 to 70 data elements that are required from every contract. And then it takes about an hour and a half for an equipment contract, up to 3 hours for a complex real estate contract, just to get those data elements. You can see that it's going to take a significant amount of time when you start multiplying that times hundreds of leases. The last component there that I won't leave off is, as I mentioned, the key financial assertion during data collection is accuracy. And in this case, once you have abstracted the data into the whatever central repository or upload template that you've chosen, there needs to be a process by which a secondary validation is done. And that validation is typically done using a sample and coverage criteria. And that's what we typically mimic what the external auditors would want to see. And in this case, they're going to want to see first that you have validated the data on a certain percentage of your estimated liability, anywhere from 60 to 75% of that estimated liability. And then anything that wasn't tested in that coverage criteria, there would be a random sample of the remaining. And that they would expect that validation would be documented in some sense. And so we'll talk about that briefly when we get to the next slide. But I will draw the distinction between data abstraction and data extraction. Data extraction, and again, this is probably where we would hope to do as much as possible. This is more of a data mapping exercise than it is a pure abstraction. And this involves transferring data from existing data sources. So this could be an internal spreadsheet that maybe is being maintained for all of your vehicles or something like that, to even upstream systems. Maybe your real estate group has a system that they use for administration that we can abstract data. And then lastly, it could be potentially even in vendor repositories. So if you have a vendor that's managing a significant asset base that's under lease, most likely they have a database that has a lot of the data elements that we would need. And we simply would then ask them for a data dump of the information so that we can map that into the upload templates to extract that data. So again, extraction is less time consuming, but it does, I will point out that most of the times that data extraction will not have all of the data elements required to complete the record. There usually is an append that has to be done to that data extraction to add GL accounts, cost centers, asset allocations, etc., that only the business would know about. And so just keep that in mind, that even if you do data extraction, there will be some manual component on the back end. And just like with data abstraction, the extraction component, there needs to be a validation exercise. The difference in this is that you're validating data that you did not take from the contract. And so in this case, when you do the validation, you actually are going to select a sample of the data elements and you are going to trace them back to the contract, not the data source where you extracted it from, but from the actual contract itself. And that will again ensure that the accuracy of the data that was being populated in the template. Lastly, I will mention there is artificial intelligence out there for those larger systems or organizations that have thousands and thousands of leases that actually make the abstraction process a little simpler. It is an AI-based data abstraction software, and it typically requires some administration. It will have a cost to it, and it does require some programming of your contracts into the system so that the system can then perform an abstraction, and then there is a data reviewer on the back end that has to go in and fill in the holes of the data that the software could not populate. That is the challenge here, is that nothing is 100%. So even if you use an AI and you got 75% of the data done through this software extraction, you would still manually have to go back in and add that 25% that perhaps the AI tool just couldn't recognize in the contract, or it wasn't relevant, or it wasn't evident in the contract. And so there should be a pretty good cost benefit analysis done on the front end just to make sure that it's right for the population that you have. As I mentioned, there's an external cost to this. There's also administrative setup time, as well as a cost per lease for the abstraction process. And then the manual component needs to be brought in at the end, as it's likely that the system will not identify every data element that you need. So when we start actually adding numbers to this, and this is just an example here of a portfolio that has about 100 leases, 20 of them equipment, 80 of them that are real estate. And if you're looking and applying some just relative, reasonable and conservative estimates to the extraction process, you can see here that the extraction of this would take about 300 hours, 280 hours in total. And if you think of that, that's seven people for a full week. Most people don't have one or two people. So in that case, if you have one person, it's going to take you 7 full weeks to do this. And most likely, you may only have 6 to 8 weeks to get it done in totality. And so the challenge there is trying to make sure that you have enough bandwidth to get the estimated hours done in the amount of time that your implementation timetable allots. So if you have 6 weeks to get all the data collection done, and you have 600 hours, you're going to have to either identify additional people to help or bring in a partner to support in that data abstraction exercise. And again, there is somewhat of a learning curve too. You have to learn the upload template. You have to know where the data needs to go, and so that will take some time also. And then this does not contemplate the validation, so the secondary check that's involved. And then I think the last complexity that I would add here is that this data, there is a secondary component of this. There is going to have to be an incremental data load that involves all of the changes that have occurred since your assessment to the date that you go live. And so you may have to replicate this entire process again for a smaller sub-selection of your leases. So it is a time-consuming, very cumbersome component of the project, of the implementation. And at the end of the day, this is what drives the journal entries on day one. And so as you can imagine, there is a lot of risk to this. So as I mentioned, the external auditors are probably going to test this. They're most likely going to want to see that you performed your own independent validation of the data, and then they will likely test the data also. So you'll see them likely select some sample and do some sample testing here. So early on in the project, I encourage a lot of my clients to do a data collection plan. So at the end of the assessment or towards the end of the assessment, you can have people that are responsible for data collection begin to analyze the population that you have and to understand where you're going to get that data. Most cases, it will be some combination of extraction and abstraction. There is going to be some parts of the portfolio where you may be able to get pre-existing data sources. And then there's going to be some components where you're just going to have to find the contract and read them. And then, at the end of the day, once you've chosen your technology solution, all of that data has to be put into upload templates. And it not only has to be put in, but it also has to be validated in the templates prior to loading that into your chosen technology solution. So we'll go to the third polling question. Which of the following challenges in the data collection will impact your organization most? Can we get that third polling question up? Number one, just locating the physical contracts. Internal resource constraints, whether it's abstracting, extracting, or even validating. Figuring out how you're going to manage that incremental data change. Lack of that technical expertise, just the people that can read a contract and abstract it. And then lastly, unsure for those that haven't started. We'll give everybody a minute to answer that question.
And Tim, just a reminder, we've got about 5 minutes left in the allotted time slot.
That's fine. I've just got software on the end, and as I mentioned, that's the easiest component of this.
Yeah, no worries at all. Just giving you a reminder.
Thank you.
Yes, the results for this one are 14% for locating the actual physical lease contracts, 30% resource constraints, 21% managing change, 13% lack of technical expertise, and then 22% is at unsure.
And I think that pretty much aligns with what we've seen in the marketplace, is that, a lot of times it's not so much that this is just a technically daunting work, but it's just time consuming. And so from a resource perspective, I think that most organizations just lack available resources to actually go through this exercise and give it the adequate urgency that it needs. I think if you had 12 months to do data collection, probably everybody'd say, oh, that's no problem. But when you talk about 300 or 400 hours in 6 weeks, that's where it becomes a problem. So thanks for that. Let's move on to system. And the last piece of that is the system implementation. And as I mentioned, this is the easier component of the actual adoption, in that we use the methodology that's been tried and true, and it's been done hundreds and hundreds of times for our clients. And the objective here is very simply to design, configure, validate, test, and deploy that lease accounting solution based upon how the organization itself wants to account for their leases under GASB 87. So the main techniques that are deployed, we use what we call workshop approach. And so we have a design and configuration workshop, we have an accounting validation workshop, we have user acceptance testing, and then we ultimately have a go live kind of checklist review. So what's involved in those various phases? So typically, during the demonstration, demo process, et cetera, that's when you're doing the analyzation and everything like that. And once you've decided on your solution, shortly after contracting, there's going to be the opportunity, or the first workshop, which is going to be the configuration and design. These are SaaS-based solutions for the most part. And so it's not going to require customization, but it will require configuration. In that configuration and design, we're taking their clients and we're taking the organization through what are the available options, how are the options configured in the system, and kind of marrying those to the organization's requirements. So making sure that the hierarchy is set up correctly, making sure that the accounts and the accounting is going to roll up to the appropriate level and so it can be booked in ultimately into the financial systems. Making sure that all of the classifications and all of the categories of leases, et cetera, mirror the way that you've identified them internally. So doing that initial configuration and design, all of these take about 3 to 4 weeks in totality to kind of move between. So once that initial configuration and design is done, we are then going to move into that second workshop, which is a validation stage. So this is when the system is actually producing some actual journal entries that we can kind of create what we call a validation workbook to ensure that and document that the accounting is being done the way that we expect it to be, and that it meets GASB 87. So these workbooks are basically what we're going to use to ensure that at the end of the day that the system is appropriately accounting for things the way that we need them to. And this also goes to our external auditor requirement to kind of make sure that we have done our own validation. The next step would be to perform a user acceptance testing. This is where you're going to get various users of the platform together to perform rote test scripts. So the test scripts are basically, there are many that are recommended, and then obviously every organization has their own specific test cases that they want to test. What I would suggest is that you just make sure that your test cases are sufficient enough that you touch on most of the functionality that you're going to necessarily need. You don't necessarily need to go down rabbit holes on potential what if scenarios, but again, test the functionality as relates to your population and your leases today, as well as any anticipated changes in your portfolio. So that you can ensure that, at the end of the day, you're signing off on a platform that's ready to go live. During this time, you're most likely also in that data collection phase is when you're kind of buttoning up that incremental data change and loading that into the system so that, we can move to this last phase, which is the go live, which is where you're basically going to align that, as of this date, we have completed all the configuration, the validation, training, user acceptance testing, all of the data is caught up, and we are now ready to move into day 2. And this is going to be the point where we we actually start using those processes that we developed early on in the methodology. And at that point, those processes and those policies take effect. There is no, light switch moment. It typically is more of a, there are no parades, there are no, fancy fireworks or anything, but it is a momentous occasion at that point to move forward into day two. And so making sure that all of those boxes have been checked and those I's have been dotted are important in that go live component. So during implementation, the things that you're going to create, that data cutover plan. So as I mentioned, understanding when is that incremental data going to end and when we're gonna cut over. And then all of the items after that being the documented UAT test scripts, the user acceptance testing sign off, the user training, the configuration sign off, as well as the validation sign off. All of that becomes available for evidence of the work that you did to ensure that the implementation went correctly. And then lastly, if there's any knowledge transfer or handoff within the organization to that day two group, that's typically occurring during this phase. So as I mentioned, this is the easier component of the process, but we don't want to lose sight that there is a significant amount of work in this, just to make sure that we get the system set up correctly and more importantly that it meets what you expect it to do. And if it doesn't meet what you expect it to do, then all of the work we've done before doesn't really necessarily matter. And so at the end of the day, making sure that you get out of the accounting system what you needed to get out of it, that being the journal entries in whatever form and rolled up at whatever level in order to facilitate financial reporting, that needs to make sure occurs. And then the last section we'll talk about is project governance. Tim,
I think we might need to. Tim, I think we might need to push to the final polling question. I think we're a little bit past our scheduled time.
That's fine. Does your organization plan to use formal project management resources to manage your adoption? Quick and easy, yes and no. As I mentioned, we highly recommend it, just simply because of the various, all of the various work streams that are typically going on at once, and the interdependencies between those work streams and the impact that they may have on the timetable. So making sure everything is aligned in all those work streams and all of the dependencies are identified in that project plan greatly improve your ability to stay on time in the implementation. When we have some final results, just let me know.
Hi, the responses. Yep, the responses we're getting so far are 29% yes, 24% no, and 46%.
Well, as I mentioned, for those that are unsure, I would highly recommend it. And again, this is born out of reality. Many of our projects early on, several years ago for the ASC 842, they failed because of the lack of comprehensive project management and the ability to align. It wasn't necessarily they failed; they just significantly went over time because one organization didn't meet their target, so it pushed back the work stream for another. So I just think it's important that you contemplate whether or not you use that. We highly recommend that you do. So at the end of the day, your organization is going to decide what you want, but I think that there's great value to be had there.
All right, thank you, Tim. Very insightful presentation on implementing GASB 87. So now that we have moved into our final polling question, we'll go ahead and try to get you jump started into the next presentation really quickly. But again, thanks, Tim, for joining us today.